From Washington, D.C., WETA presents A Conversation with Rod Serling, eminent author and television and film writer. In cooperation with the Library of Congress, Mr. Serling discusses television as a medium for the literary artist, the writer, with James Dickey, consultant in poetry at the Library of Congress, and Bernie Harrison, television critic and editor of the Washington Star.
Any conversation on television for the past 10 years with a representative of television could open with the observation that this has probably been the worst year in the history of the medium. Now, what are your views on it, Rod? And do you see any hope for an upbeat in quality or in balance even?
Well, first of all, I'd have to make comment on the show title, Bernie, A Conversation with Rod Serling, which carries with it a kind of built-in pretension, like a conversation with Carl Sandburg or some equally wise man. And indeed, I'm not being humble. I just worry about that sobriquet, A Conversation with Rod Serling. But in direct response, you're quite right. It seems that each succeeding year is a little less exciting than the previous, that we seem to be wallowing in a very ruddish concept here. Most noteworthy being the lack of ingenuity, the lack of new concepts, the lack of new ideas and new approaches. The fact that we should be producing, I think, a body of exciting modern literature in this marvelous new electronic media, and aren't. It's reached a point now, I guess, where when something noteworthy is on, it shines simply by virtue of comparison. It is so unique by virtue of its aloneness. Now, as to where we're going, I would like to say, hopefully, well, now maybe next year, we'll come back with something more definitive, more responsive to intellectual taste and the like. But I've already seen the penciled-in so-called blueprint of next year's performances, and they seem like virtually carbon copy of everything we've had.
What are the prospects for return of anthology drama? Now, I know that this is a point that's continually raised, and it seems that the economics of the business dictates against it. Sponsors don't like to be associated with programs that have different casts every week. They like to be able to buy the star, like Lorne Greene, so he can step out of character and sell the Chevrolets.
That's right. And that, of course, has been a major deterrent to the anthology concept. And to date, every time I talk to any network people, and they say, "What have you got for us?" which is becoming increasingly rare. I'm hardly approached at all anymore, except for a cigarette in the hall if they've run out. And I will say, well, why not a marvelously exciting, regularly scheduled dramatic show which makes comment on the times? Good God, there's enough controversy and drama, implicit in our daily lives to warrant a dramatic approach. And they in turn say, no, not anthology. And indeed, they must have the continuing running character. This, I think, stems from the fact that the networks have forever thought of an audience as some kind of mongoloid personages with IQs and negative figures who cannot retain any kind of close association unless they are thrust into the maelstrom of familiar names week after week after week. It must be a single character running from a one-armed man. It must be a guy dying of incurable disease. We must associate constantly. Well, indeed, this is the reason no body of literature is coming out. It's like asking Arthur Miller to write a story about salesmen every time he takes a typewriter or a pen. It simply doesn't sustain legitimate drama when you write about one guy week after week. I'm not making a judgment against that show. There's a place for these, but the word you use that I think is key, Bernie, is balance. Why aren't there comparable programs?
What about children's programming in the afternoon? At least in the early days of television, they were making an effort in that direction. The shows may not have been very good, but to abandon the field entirely in the afternoon and in the early evening. And here we are in the presence of a poet, and the last time most of us saw a poet on television was at a presidential inauguration. That's a long time to wait.
Well, what interests me very much about what you gentlemen are saying is that you both deplore the lack of quality on television, the lack of things that are good, or as you say, Rod, exciting and new. And yet, it seems to me that the whole concept of what is good is open to question by what approach you use to it. I suppose the program, the network officials would define as something being good as something that moves an awful lot of merchandise, whereas a television critic or a movie critic or someone like that with a vested interest in the literary end of it would not necessarily take that that particular point of view. Now, what is frightening about the whole situation, as far as doing the kind of thing that you were talking about doing, Rod, is that the very agencies, the advertising agencies, the clients, the networks, and so on, have the whole concept of what is going to be put on television so embroiled with the profit motive that there's absolutely no way to get around it.
Well, it reaches the point, and I think this is the response to Bernie's idea as to what are the futures of this thing. So long as you're appealing to in a sense, a totally commercial entity whose job it is to move product, whose use of the media is principally and primarily as a display case for commercial goods, then wherein lies a challenge to networks to improve the quality of their product. However, there's a strange inconsistency in criteria which is forever exercised. It may well be the truth that the network will push for the show, which they know will get the rating. But when the stockholders get their reports, and when the public relations people handle the network throwaways, it's usually that program which they bugle about, like The Private War of Ollie Winter. This is what our network does. We do dramatic shows like this, as if they did The Private War of Ollie Winter once a week. In point of fact, it was one show, one exceptionally exciting, terribly moving, and I think decidedly qualitative piece of work. With whatever small artistic criticisms you might want to make against it, it was nonetheless a cut above. But I've seen the CBS press releases, and it's all Ollie Winter. This year it'll be the Reggie Rose Show. It'll be Dear Friends. This is what we do on our network.
I don't want to speak for one side or the other, although it surely must be obvious which side my sentiments are with. But the concept of television, a mass media kind of presentation such as television is, has something to do with the question of what you can conceive of as being the purpose of television. Do you look at it primarily as entertainment? The fellow watching a show, which he doesn't want any deep dramatic meaning, he doesn't want catharsis, he only wants to be entertained. Do you look at it as entertainment or as an art form?
That's the oft-asked, properly asked question. And in informal moments when you can buttonhole a network executive, he will say to you that indeed no, it is not the responsibility of the networks to enlighten, to educate, to lift the intellectual values and interests of a populace. Not at all. They are simply there to reflect what are the entertainment tastes of the masses. They have forever said this, not publicly, but in any private conversation, this is principally what they will say.
This is very much of a chicken or the egg kind of thing.
Exactly.
Are the tastes of the people so deplorable because they are not given anything better, or the shows on television deplorable because the tastes of the people are bad initially?
I think Bernie Harrison may have a point on this, but my particular view, Jim, is that of late, and I have never been a plea copper, I've never begged off an issue before, but I'm beginning to believe that there is a strange groundswell amongst the American populace, the citizenry, that would seek out an escape away from reality of late, that their tastes lie much toward the entertainment quality rather than the cerebral quality.
I don't think there's any question of that at all.
I think it is not only evidenced in television, but more pronouncedly in the proscenium drama. What has Broadway produced as a vehicle of social criticism that in any way harkens back to the Odetzian days, or the G.B. Shaws, or the Ibsens? When a play made a point, by God, they had an axe to grind about what was a current social evil, and they made it.
When a play moved you as a human being.
Precisely, and for that reason it was written.
Sure.
Next fall, NBC will have a movie on Monday in prime time, thereby giving us a movie every night of the week. That'll be 3 nights for NBC, 2 for CBS, and 2 for ABC. And I predicted that very shortly the 3 networks would petition Congress to change the week to 9 days so that each of them could have 3 nights. But to go along with that point, I believe some national group predicted that we were heading for a national nervous breakdown, the anxieties and so forth. Now, when you put on an old movie, it's possible that it'll be a movie made about some social problem, but a problem that was contemporary 6, 7, 10, 15 years, 20 years ago. And that makes it safe.
Oh, no question
And
about it.
again, this is the kind of programming that television, national television seems to be, this escapist type.
It's reminiscent of television in its early days, when indeed there was certainly a race problem in those days. It wasn't out in the street. It wasn't loud in our ears. It wasn't infesting our gut, our conscious gut, as it is today. But by God, there was anguish amongst minorities then as there is now.
I remember
And
that play you wrote, A Town Turned to
Oh,
Dust.
yeah,
Wasn't-
well, you see, then you assaulted the straw men who were acceptable as minority groups. Mexicans, American Indians, Eskimos, beaten down, downtrodden peasants under the Tsar.
But not
These were the
Negroes.
minorities, but not the Negro. Now, consequently, I think the purpose, the point of a dramatic show, which is used as a vehicle of social criticism, is to involve an audience, to show them wherein their guilt lies, or at least, indeed, their association. But when you're talking about a bunch of cavalrymen knocking off a bunch of poor redskins and putting them into a reservation, the audience need to have no association, certainly no guilt. How many Indians have they pushed into a reservation? But if indeed you talk about a denial of a man putting his garbage can next to yours, whether he's fought in Vietnam or wherever, by virtue of his color, now you're getting into a universal guilt, which they should feel, or at least in part understand.
You can extend that and dilate around a very important word that I think that you use, Rod. This word involvement. How much is an audience caught up in a particular show or a particular situation shown on television? And I would maintain that very rarely is there any intimacy of involvement with anything that one sees on television, or sense of identification. It doesn't have to be social commentary. It can be any kind of show which allows one to participate in any kind of an insightful situation. I think, as a writer, I'm interested in images and the memorability of things. I know lines of poetry, some stray random lines that I remember because they're just so good. You know, of the images I can remember from television shows, there are very few, because it's not intended to be memorable. Most of it, it's intended to flush right out.
Right.
You see it, it has no memory value. And this is really not contributing to a person's individual being.
Well, that's when I talked about I think the incredible lack of a body of literature that could evolve from this medium, which is certainly as exciting, as far-reaching, as immediate as any art form we've ever had. And yet, when you start looking back at the so-called memorable moments, they are few and far between.
They sure are. Well, I know people like Marshall McLuhan say that it really doesn't matter what's on television. The medium is the message, and the fact that something is on the screen is delivering the message of the fact that the television set is on, I suppose, if I can follow him. But I think it very much does matter what is put on the screen.
Well, there's always, in the offset argument, of course, that television functions and operates in the public air, and ostensibly, at least by act of Federal Communications Commission, in the public interest. And indeed, if you talk public, now you mean all public, all facets, all strata. And that doesn't mean the minority 70 million, it also means the minority 18 million. They must be made, you know, a proper audience. Their taste must be concerned with, their attitudes must be responded to, and they're not. Not by a long shot. I'm not suggesting that we suddenly develop a gigantic school of protest here, or of social comment, in which we preoccupy ourselves with commentative drama, this sort of thing. But I do believe the nature of the times now demand that television takes positions, that it exposes both sides of controversy. I've yet, for example, I keep thinking this awful thing, not to inject a political note into this, but I have a feeling we're dealing with a faceless enemy in terms of the Vietnamese. At least when Jack Warner ran Warner Brothers, I knew what a Japanese soldier looked like, albeit a cartoon version. He had gigantic teeth and myopic vision, and he ran around assaulting nuns and torturing Clark Gable. And indeed, the Nazi was the unregenerative animal with a whip. And he pointed with the whip for these 1,000 to go into that gas chamber and so and so. Now television gives us Hogan's Heroes. And next year, I suppose it'll be the Merry Men of Auschwitz.
Yes.
And a big a dance thing on the Death March of Bataan.
Yeah, ballet maybe.
A ballet of that sort. You see, I think this is a distortion. Now, when we're talking about, if indeed they want to have the temerity to suggest what is a moment in American history or world history, do it properly.
But you know, one thing, I generally rather dislike television, although like most Americans, I find myself watching it a good deal because, like the mountain, it's there. I don't care much for the dramatic things. We've been talking mainly about the dramatic shows. But what television really is very good at is any kind of sports coverage. I think it's absolutely wonderful. But some of these talk shows, Face the Nation and so on, or what is it, Meet the Press and so on, those people really do ask questions that one would like to see asked.
But really, Jim, then you're utilizing television simply as a disseminator.
But that's all right. I think that part of it.
And marvelous. But the football game that goes on between UCLA and Notre Dame is brilliant and marvelous, and the camera work is, you know, sublime. But it is not the television that is so good. It's that sporting event, properly covered.
Yeah, properly covered.
But I'm talking about the more creative aspects of television.
Yes, right, well, in your field, surely.
But what about, if we're going to have plays or shows that say something, then we need to get back in the television people who want to say things and can say them. And whatever we say about the early days of television, it brought along a lot of fascinating young people, writers, actors. The movies are living off of these people.
Indeed.
The directors, Frankenheimer and so on. You can name 20 writers, 20 directors, 40 or 50 actors. Now the networks seem to have turned over this making of shows to Hollywood. And we have a sort of a vast Hollywood repertory company. You see the same actor as the heavy one night. It may be his week on television. He just happened to have made all of these shows at one time, and they come out all at once. And he looks a little dazed as he goes through them because he's not quite sure whether he's in a Western or
It's a funny repertory company which does 11,000 plays concurrently on the same stage. And you're a little confused without a scorecard, that kind of thing.
And of course you have the same writers.
That's
They
right.
don't get, now, you have an economic squeeze. The squeeze inevitably has its effect first on the writing end of it, the creative end of it.
Well, the Writers Guild of America West at the moment is currently involved in a big reappraisal of the whole creative or lack thereof creativity in terms of the writer's interest and the writer's point of view. And they're holding a series of confabs and symposiums in which their principal position is that it's not a lack of writing, it's a lack of platform. And I think they've got a point. In point of fact, in 1950, when I began when I started writing for the medium, those were the days of the television giants. This was Chayefsky time, and Reggie Rose time, and Gore Vidal time, and Johnny Frankenheimer, Arthur Penn. They were all there. Sidney Lumet. Every major motion picture figure was then in television. Marty Ritt, the names are legion. Not one of them is a regular contributor to television. 95%, and that's a fairly conservative estimate, have no relationship to television anymore. Reggie's recent dear friend, I think, is the first thing he's done for TV in better than 3 or 4 years.
I don't think it's necessary to have them back in the television, but let's get a lot of young.
A new young school, quite right.
I agree. I surely do. What little I know of it, I would say this, that the worst thing as far as the creative talent, the creative man, the really dramatic writer is concerned, is that he is dogged with this dreadful formula kind of presentation. People want formula shows.
Well, how many times can you write The Fugitive and feel excited and feel challenged and feel inspired? I challenge, you know, any writer retaining any kind of perspective, any kind of criteria, self-criteria for what is qualitative writing, if each week he has to write about the same kind of guy.
Well, I saw about 4 or 5 years ago, and I hope you wrote this one, Rod. I saw a
Probably
two-part thing about doctors called, a play called Doctors, called No Deadly Medicine, with Lee J. Cobb.
Arthur Haley wrote that,
Which
I
was the
believe.
most eloquent and moving drama I have ever seen on television.
That's right.
Pretty near.
I could be doing somebody a terrible injustice, but my recollection is that Arthur Haley, a very
And
good
that's
He was a
one.
pathologist, wasn't
That's
he?
right.
That's right.
And the
Later
Star
done as a
Trek
novel.
guy was a
Bill Shatner, yeah.
Shatner was
Supposed
the
to be
young doctor.
Pilot of a series that they made later on. Bill Shatner didn't get it.
But that was an eloquent and moving thing.
Oh, and I can remember many like that. I can remember some of the half-hour shows on East Side, West Side, which I found definitive.
George Scott.
I think it's
yeah.
possible
With
to
Scott.
do a quality show for, within the series framework. I think your show,
I
Twilight
agree.
Zone,
I agree.
in the area of science fiction, did a very good job of bringing some imaginative writing and some nice
But
performances.
of course, that was pure anthology, but what we had going, and which was our excuse to remain on the air for 5 years, Bernie, was simply that we did have a thread of continuity. We had a concept, which was science fiction, fantasy, the occult.
Well, what bothers me, gentlemen, about this is that if we agree that we have on television a presentation with the quality, as we see quality, that the vast public will not necessarily like it. Maybe it's too close to home. Maybe it shakes them up too much. Maybe that's not what they want from television.
It's a moot question, but I have always maintained, Jim, that any audience with any kind of brain at all will respond to that
I
which is
agree
exciting.
with you. This is something
Now,
that
you
we
may have
must
to
believe.
tell them a story
That's
of prejudice in
Yeah.
parable form, in
Yeah.
which they may step aside as third persons and cluck and say, how awful we treat our minority groups. But at least they know that it's an evil, and they will recognize it as such. And by osmosis or some incredible process, will somewhere along the line be faced with a situation in which they too may have to exercise a prejudice and be conscious of it as an evil. Now, on Twilight Zone, for example, done during just as timorous a time as any other time, we made a comment on prejudice, on conformity, on intolerance, on censorship. But it's easy to do it when you're talking about Buck Rogers isn't allowed to write his memoirs in the way he wants to write them.
Yes.
So he puts on his backpack, his rocket pack, and he zooms over to the publisher. And they applaud and laugh and think how exciting and interesting. Now, it may well be that the inner message may never get through, but I think peripherally it does get through.
I myself am not so interested as you seem to be in drama which makes a social commentary of some sort. I realize the legitimacy of this and the necessity of it. But what I would hold out for is just any kind of drama that deeply involves the audience as human beings,
Right.
that they can really truly participate in.
I agree with you.
And that is the TV that I'm looking forward to seeing.
Did you see
I
Dear
agree with that.
Friends, Bernie? Did you see Dear
I
Friends?
saw it, yes. I couldn't buy his premise to begin with, and then I thought, it seemed to me, with all due respect to Reginald Rose, that this was an idea he had kicking around for some time, because some of the relationships between the couples were a little antique.
There was an Albie-ish feeling.
It's
wasn't
not
there?
the social commentary that's so important, making us the point that is important, but the fact that the man who sat down to write this play has written it in the same time in which we are living right now, through the same problems that we are living with now, and we are seeing actors who are exposed to the same conditions that we live in now, so that this is what is meant by immediacy, the presentation of a thing that was written within the period of months on television for an audience, that so that all of the dialogue and lines will have reference to the things that are going. It doesn't have to make an important point about prejudice.
Right. I understand. I wasn't exclusively limiting good drama to the area of social comment. It happened to be one of the areas which we've been so far away from for so long, but I share your feeling entirely, Jim. A story of human beings, of human conflict, told in legitimate, valid human terms.
With no formulas.
With no formulas. Let it not be a man running away from
Right.
a one-armed man.
We need to get some good storytellers back in.
Yeah.
No, you need a platform built. The storytellers are there waiting. If you travel on any college campus nowadays, the writing talent is there in abundance,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it dies surely from lack of exposure.
Do you see NBC and CBS vying with IBM and General Motors for the talent on the campuses?
Then a new brain drain. Is that what they? Yeah. I have not seen the networks in any militant search for good talent. I've always felt this is one of the major problems, that we are not developing a school of artists
You
because
buy
there's
them
no...
from other media. They come from the stage.
Always that. Recommended by the interest, sometimes exclusively by the interest advanced by somebody else. That's why we all went to Hollywood and worked for motion picture studios. Not because they felt that we were any good. Most of them looked down their noses at television. It was kind of an Aborigine child, which they had in a way, strangely enough, spawned. And they never thought much of our talent. But Warner Brothers thought Metro was interested in us, so Warner Brothers hired us, or the reverse. This happened all the time. I was telling you in the car, Jim, that when I went to Metro Goldwyn Mayer under contract in '56, I was there 12 weeks in an office, eating in the commissary every lunch, with a secretary and a typewriter and a dictaphone, and never wrote a word and never met a person for 12 weeks. Just sat there and drew my check and improved my chess game.
Well, it's a miracle you made it back then.
It's a miracle I made it back to Washington, I think, under those conditions.
Well, The television season this year, despite the critical abuse, has produced 40 or 50 shows, which if you had been home at the time that was convenient to the network, you might have seen and enjoyed. And in the area of the documentaries, I think television does a pretty good job.
I think they do an exceptionally good job. I do wish, though, that the documentaries would take more of a definite stand, a point of view. And I'm not asking for a particular stand. I hark back now, Bernie, to a very effective documentary that I saw on NBC called Same Blood, Same Mud, with Frank McGee, I believe. The footage, the combat footage, was tremendously, I hate to use the word exciting. We're talking of death now.
Yes.
Let's say that it was stunning, that it was horrendous, that it moved you. It created a reaction. But Frank McGee disturbed me because he would interview the white soldier and he would say, what do you think of your Negro colleague? And the white soldier would look at him and say, what do you mean, what do I think of him? He's a GI, he's on my right, he covers me on the attack, he does this. And McGee would cluck and say, my gosh, listen to that.
Yeah,
and I kept thinking, why are you amazed, Mr. McGee?
Yeah.
In the province of combat, when you stake your life,
How could it be any other
how could
way?
it be any other way?
Yeah.
And more to the point would have been, what happens to that Negro soldier, having lived through this incredibly strange, colorless world, say, for a period of a horrendous 12 or 13 months, and he goes back to the state of California, and under the tutelage of our governor there, tries to exist in a society in which there is a public law on record which denies him proper housing by virtue of the color of his skin. How does he feel then? Let's take our camera into that chap's living room and see with what equanimity
But
he
it's
greets the
been
current.
there. The camera's been there. I've seen that in several.
Well, the Public Broadcasting
documentaries.
Laboratory, I think, started something on that, the PBL.
Yes,
Incidentally, what do you
yes.
think of that series?
I just
which
saw
is-
the one play they did, Day of Reckoning or Day of Disappearance or something.
It was
Yeah,
the first
which I
show.
thought was slightly overdone, but which I was very intrigued by.
It was an intriguing idea, and some of the criticism was that it ran much too long.
Oh, it
And the
did.
point was made that the author insisted that the whole play be presented. And here again, we come to the point of the tyranny of the author,
Gee,
as opposed to, which
the
is very
tyranny
unusual.
of the author, Bernie Harrison. Gee, I
I
haven't
thought
heard
that was
that
a long
term.
dead tyranny. It's now the tyranny of the
happens
network.
every now and
I
then.
haven't heard of the tyranny of the author since Elizabethan times, to tell you the truth. And if indeed it exists, I'm delighted that it does
It
exist.
did on that occasion. I
I
understand.
work
that
in a
he-
medium, of course, in which the director has always been the king in terms of motion pictures, and in television, the director is perhaps a crown prince, but the king lives, someplace where they make the cereal. in
Yeah, the
Michigan, I
king
think.
is really the advertising accountant man.
I think the final judge of that which is put on
Have you
would
seen
not
any?
be
Have you seen any of these shows, Jim? That
the PBL thing.
I don't
Ford
think so.
Foundation money. It's on Sunday night on Channel 26
I
in
may
Washington.
have, was
the
that
educational.
marvelous Peter Watkins thing, the Battle of Culloden Moor? Was that
No,
one
that
of
was a
those?
British.
That was a
Boy,
Canadian
wasn't
thing,
that
wasn't it?
good?
Fantastic.
Wasn't that something?
Was that the
Beautiful.
Canadian thing or the
No,
British thing?
British.
I saw that, and that I couldn't shake. I can't shake it.
Oh, yes.
I
That
can't
wasn't
shake it.
the dropping of the hydrogen
No,
bomb
that's
in
the same
British
fellow.
community.
Same fellow.
Because
This was an
that
early
was
film
one
of
of the most
his.
stunning documentaries I've ever
It was
seen.
an early film of Watkins. You mean what is it, the War Game? Is
Yeah,
that?
the War Game or
Yeah,
something
that's
like
him.
that.
But this was an early film that he made on almost nothing for the BBC called The Ballad of Culloden Moor. The vain attempt. of
From
Rod
Washington,
Serling.
you've been watching A Conversation with Rod Serling. Joining Mr. Serling in a look at television as a medium for the literary artist, the writer, were Mr. James Dickey, consultant in poetry at the Library of Congress, and Mr. Bernie Harrison, television critic and editor of the Washington Star. Mr. Serling's appearance was made possible through a grant from the Gertrude Clark Whittall Fund of the Library of Congress.
This is the Eastern Educational Network.